They find the car in a locked garage, the hose feeding exhaust into the window, and two bodies posed like a final embrace. Castlerock calls it a suicide pact and moves on. But the story doesn't end in 1991, because nearly 20 years later, a respected dentist walks into a church meeting and confesses.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
Tonight we have a case from Northern Ireland, where a quiet seaside village woke to a scene that looked like heartbreak and was filed away as tragedy. In the early morning hours of May 19th, 1991, behind a holiday cottage in Castlerock, a garage door is opened and a car is found sitting in the dim light. Inside are two bodies, Lesley Howell, a young mother, and Trevor Buchanan, a police constable. A length of hose runs from the exhaust pipe toward a cracked window, feeding the cabin with fumes. To investigators, it appears to be a suicide pact, a grim private decision made by two people whose lives had been shaken by betrayal. For nearly 2 decades, that garage in Castlerock keeps it secret, until in 2009, Colin Howell steps forward and makes a confession that tears the case wide open. Suddenly, what looked like a tragic double death becomes something far more deliberate. A staged tableau built to mislead investigators and bury the truth in plain sight. We're telling that story tonight. A damp dawn broke over the seaside village of Castlerock in Northern Ireland on May 19th, 1991. The salty breeze carried an acrid smell that morning, the telltale odor of exhaust fumes seeping from a nondescript garage behind a quiet holiday cottage. Inside that small outbuilding, a passerby made a horrific discovery. In a parked car, the bodies of 2 people were locked in a final embrace with death. 31-year-old Lesley Howell lay sprawled in the back seat, her fingers still clutching photographs of her young children. In the front seat slumped 32-year-old Trevor Buchanan, a police constable. A length of rubber hose snaked from the car's exhaust pipe into a slightly open window, making the scene look, at first glance, painfully straightforward. It looked like a mutual death pact, a tragic double suicide. The position of the bodies and that hose feeding poisonous gas into the car told a story of despair. Lesley and Trevor were both married, but not to each other. Rumors had quietly circulated about an affair between Lesley's husband and Trevor's wife, and now here were the apparent consequences. To the first officers on the scene, the tableau suggested 2 betrayed spouses who had lost all hope and made a fatal decision together. By all appearances, this was a sorrowful but straightforward case. 2 innocent people, driven by heartbreak, had met in secret to end their pain. In the immediate aftermath, investigators treated the scene as a double suicide because the staging fit. A car in a locked garage exhaust fumes, and 2 bodies positioned to suggest a pact. That early conclusion matters because it shaped what was and wasn't questioned at the time. Years later, when the case was revisited after new information surfaced, detectives re-examined the same details through a different lens. Not, why would they do this, but who benefits if everyone believes that they did? The community mourned the loss. Lesley Howell was known as a devoted mother of 4, and Trevor Buchanan a steadfast policeman and father. Their funerals were packed with grieving family, friends, and fellow church members offering condolences and prayers. Everyone believed they understood what had happened in that fume-filled car by the coast, but as the village grieved what they thought was a shared tragedy, a far more sinister truth lay hidden beneath that neat narrative. What the community believed was a suicide pact would later be revealed as something carefully orchestrated, an elaborate lie that held for almost 2 decades. On the surface, Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan, later Hazel Stewart, looked like 2 people with everything to lose. Colin was a local dentist and lay preacher. Hazel was married to a police constable and active in church life. In public, both families projected stability, faith, and respectability. The kind of image that made a community assume nothing truly dark could be happening behind their smiles. But closed doors helped to project a seemingly wholesome world. In reality, temptation was taking hold. Colin and Hazel's paths crossed frequently, at services on Sunday, at prayer meetings, even during their children's weekday swimming lessons. A flirtation sparked and then flared into a full-blown secret romance. They stole kisses in dark parking lots after Bible study and exchanged longing glances across crowded church halls. Every illicit rendezvous was cloaked in lies told to their unsuspecting spouses. To the outside world, Colin remained the attentive husband to Lesley, and Hazel the devoted wife to Trevor. But in stolen moments, they only had eyes for each other. It didn't take long for cracks to appear in the facade. Lesley Howell began to sense that something was wrong in her marriage. Colin's late nights at the clinic, or sudden urgency to assist parishioners, seemed increasingly suspicious. One day, Lesley discovered a trace of the affair. A misplaced note, a whisper in the congregation, or perhaps just Colin's guilt manifesting in cold distance. Whatever the trigger, the revelation hit her hard. Lesley confronted her husband, and although Colin brushed off or minimized the infidelity, she was left devastated. The once vivacious young mother fell into despair. Friends later recalled how Lesley, normally outgoing, grew quiet and withdrawn in those months. She began self-medicating her heartbreak with wine and prescription pills. Photographs from that period show her smile had faded. The hurt was plain in her eyes, even if she tried to keep up appearances. Trevor, too, may have sensed that his wife Hazel was growing distant, though he never openly voiced suspicions. As a police officer, Trevor knew how to notice details, but Hazel was careful. If he asked about her occasional absences or the late-night phone calls she dismissed as wrong numbers, Hazel soothed him with practiced reassurances. Inside, however, her nerves were frayed. The dual life she led, loving wife and mother by day, adulterous lover by night, weighed heavily. Each Sunday, Hazel taught Bible stories about honesty and fidelity to the children at church, then spent weekday afternoons sneaking away to Colin's arms. Guilt and fear of exposure loomed over them both. By early 1991, the situation was precarious. Lesley's depression had deepened, and talk of the Howell Buchanan affair quietly swirled among a few church gossips. Colin felt cornered. His wife's misery threatened to spill their secret into the open. Hazel likewise feared losing everything if the truth came out, the respect of her community, and even the custody of her children. Divorce was anathema in their devout circle and would mean public disgrace. Colin began to contemplate a darker way out. In his mind, an unthinkable idea took shape. If Lesley and Trevor were gone permanently, all of his problems would be solved. The affair could continue unfettered, and their religious reputations could remain intact. All he needed was for his lover to agree to an audacious and deadly plan. According to later accounts, Colin Howell's proposition to Hazel was as cold-blooded as it was audacious. They would kill Lesley and Trevor and make it look like a joint suicide. At first, Hazel balked. The thought of murdering her husband, of murdering anyone, sent her reeling. But Colin was methodical and persuasive. He painted a picture of a life where they could finally be together, free from lies and guilt. Divorce, he argued, would ruin them in their tight-knit community. But if their spouses died tragically, they could eventually comfort each other openly, without scandal. When Hazel hesitated, Colin pressed harder. He hinted at dire consequences if she betrayed him or refused to go along. Isolated by their secret and under Colin's tightening grip, Hazel finally acquiesced. In that moment, their illicit love story warped into a deadly conspiracy. From here on, try to keep two lanes in mind: what can be proven, what was said, what was found, what was admitted, and what's being interpreted. Why someone did it, what someone felt, what someone must have intended. Prosecutors can argue motive, confessions can describe intent, and here we stay honest about the difference. They spent weeks refining the plan in whispered discussions and clandestine notes. Colin decided they would strike on a night when both households were quiet and unsuspecting. He obtained a supply of sedatives, intending to dose Lesley and Trevor to ensure they'd be subdued or asleep when the time came. So committed was he to this plan that Colin even conducted a disturbing experiment. Under the guise of dental work, he sedated Hazel in his clinic chair to test the potency of the drugs. Hazel awoke groggy and violated. Colin had allegedly assaulted her while she was unconscious. But she said nothing. Whatever the intent, the message to Hazel was clear. He had total control, and the plan had to proceed. For the murders, Colin chose a method meant to be quiet and hard to detect in the moment, one that relied on exhaust fumes and a sealed space rather than a weapon that would leave a loud, obvious signature. The goal, according to later accounts, was to keep the victims incapacitated and avoid any struggle, then arrange the scene so it read as a tragic decision rather than a crime. Colin selected the location for that final tableau with care. He chose the garage at an empty property owned by Lesley's late father, a secluded spot where a car could be left running without drawing attention. After murdering his wife at the Howell home, Colin would drive Lesley's body, and later Trevor's, to this garage in Castlerock. There, he and Hazel would position the two victims in a single vehicle. Trevor would be in the driver's seat, and Lesley in the back. Colin even planned to tuck those family photographs into Lesley's lifeless hands, a poignant touch to reinforce the illusion of a grief-stricken mother taking her own life. They would insert the hose from the exhaust into the car window and let the engine run, ensuring the scene looked convincingly like a double suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Every detail was anticipated. Hazel and Colin rehearsed their alibis. They would each pretend to discover their spouse missing in the early morning hours, feigning confusion and concern. If anyone asked, they would express shock that Lesley and Trevor might have met up. They agreed on how to act grief-stricken but not suspicious. Hazel would dutifully play the distraught widow, Colin the heartbroken widower. And so, with chilling calmness, the lovers set their murderous plot into motion, waiting for the right night to execute it. The night of the plan arrived, moonless and still. Hazel later described an eerie sense of detachment as she went through her evening routine, tucking her children into bed as if it were any ordinary night. Trevor dozed off on the living room sofa, unaware that it would be his last sleep. Miles away in the Howell house, Lesley had turned in for the night after checking on her own young children. She had no idea her husband was slipping lethal ingredients into the cup of hot cocoa, which he insisted on making her to help her relax. By 1 a.m., both target victims were unconscious or in a heavy stupor, and Colin Howell was ready to act. Colin stood over his sleeping wife in the darkened bedroom, his face lit only by a sliver of streetlight through the window. Lesley lay on her side, breathing deeply from the sedatives in her system. In one hand, Colin carried the end of a length of hose, fitted with the rubber nipple from a baby's bottle. Outside, his car was already running in the driveway, a long coil of hose snaking from the exhaust through a window into the bedroom. Colin gently pressed the improvised gas mask over Lesley's mouth and nose. For a few moments, nothing changed. She continued to breathe slowly, oblivious. Then her body gave a jolt as the first toxic fumes hit her lungs. She coughed and stirred, but Colin held the mask firmly in place. Lesley's eyes fluttered open in confusion. Half conscious and sensing mortal danger, she tried to pull away, feebly kicking at the bed covers. A faint whimper escaped her. In her final moments, she gasped out the name of her eldest child, a plea or a prayer. But there was no saving her. Colin's hand did not relent. After a minute or two of struggle, Lesley Howell fell still, overcome by the exhaust fumes flooding her bloodstream. Colin remained there a moment, watching the life drain from his wife's body. The quiet ticking of the clock resumed its dominance in the room. He finally removed the hose and shut off the car engine outside. A sickly chemical odor hung in the air as he worked quickly now, knowing he had limited time before dawn. He wrapped Lesley's lifeless body in a blanket and hoisted her over his shoulder. Colin carried Lesley out to his car. The night was silent except for his labored breaths and the chirp of distant crickets. He placed her body in the trunk and carefully shut it. With Lesley secured, Colin slipped into the driver's seat and drove into the darkness toward Hazel's house. He had to move swiftly and silently. Streetlights cast intermittent pools of pale gold on the empty road as he covered the few miles to the Buchanan home. Hazel was waiting, her heart pounding in her chest. She had left a back door unlocked and a window slightly ajar for Colin's entry. Her 2 children were fast asleep upstairs, innocent to the horror about to unfold under their roof. Colin killed his headlights and rolled to a quiet stop in Hazel's driveway. He retrieved the same hose apparatus from his trunk, now reeking of exhaust fumes, and crept toward the house. Hazel met him just inside the back door, her face ghost pale and drawn. Without a word, she led him into the living room, where Trevor lay slumped on the couch, a half-empty glass of beer on the side table next to him. Trevor Buchanan was oblivious, snoring lightly, still in his day clothes. Colin had left his car idling outside. Now he guided the hose in through the open window, behind the couch. In one swift motion, he slipped the rubber mask over Trevor's nose and mouth, and signaled Hazel to shut the door. For a moment, she turned away, unable to watch, but the effect was not as quick as with Lesley. The first gush of fumes jolted Trevor awake in confusion and terror. His eyes snapped wide at the sight of a figure looming over him with a hose. Trevor's survival instincts kicked in, and he thrashed violently, knocking the mask aside. A desperate struggle exploded in the darkness. Trevor was strong, a trained RUC officer, and for an instant he had the upper hand, grappling Colin's wrist and forcing the mask away. Hazel stifled a scream as the 2 men wrestled in her living room, knocking over furniture. Colin, fueled by adrenaline and panic, managed to drive a knee hard into Trevor's stomach and wrench free. He lunged again, this time managing to clamp the mask back over Trevor's face with all his weight behind it. Hazel, shaking, moved in to help pin down Trevor's flailing arms. It took endless seconds of grim effort, but at last, Trevor's fight began to ebb. His thrashing limbs slowed, then went limp. The only sounds now were Hazel's ragged breaths and the low chug of the car outside, pumping in poison. In the aftermath of the fight, the living room was in shambles. An overturned chair, a shattered glass, and Trevor Buchanan's body sprawled at an unnatural angle on the couch. Hazel stood in the corner, pressed against the wall with wide, vacant eyes. She had just assisted in killing her husband, and the shock was sinking in. Colin, ever cold-minded, sprang into action once more. He removed the hose and closed up the window, erasing the most obvious evidence of their method. Then he gestured for Hazel to grab Trevor's feet. Together, they heaved his corpse off the sofa and through the back door into the cool night. Outside, the dawn was still an hour away. They lifted Trevor into the car, propping his lifeless form from behind the wheel. Lesley's blanketed corpse lay in the back seat, just as planned. Hazel caught a glimpse of Lesley's pale hand slipping out from under the covering and quickly looked away, swallowing down a rising feeling of nausea. Colin worked fast and efficiently. He arranged Trevor as if he were the driver and gently opened Lesley's limp hand to curl her fingers around the cherished photographs of her children. With Hazel's help, he inserted the hose one final time through the window and restarted the engine. They stood back as the car's interior once again filled with lethal fumes, enveloping the two bodies in an atmosphere of death. Bathed in the dim glow of a single bare bulb, Colin and Hazel surveyed the scene they had created. Lesley Howell and Trevor Buchanan sat, motionless, inside the vehicle, pallid and inert, looking for all the world like a pair of broken souls who had chosen to die together. The smell of exhaust and death was thick. Hazel was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Colin placed a hand on her shoulder, stern and steady. It was time to leave. He shut off the engine for the last time and carefully removed the hose, leaving it coiled conspicuously from the tailpipe into the car as planned. The stage was finally set. Just before 4 a.m., with the eastern sky beginning to brighten, Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan slipped away from the garage. They pulled the door closed on the fume-saturated tomb and parted ways into what was left of the night. Colin driving back to his house where his children slept, motherless, and Hazel returning to her own home to await morning with her fatherless children. By the time the sun rose over Castlerock on May 19th, 1991, the murderous pair had done everything in their power to ensure that the awaited discovery looked like nothing more than a tragic suicide pact between two devastated spouses. By the next morning, Colin and Hazel's deadly plan appeared to have achieved exactly what they intended. The scene in the garage spoke for itself, and investigators found nothing obviously amiss. When police delivered the grim news, Colin and Hazel played their roles. Shocked spouses, reluctant confessors to an affair, and grieving survivors of what seemed like a scandal-driven tragedy. With that context in place, authorities quickly concluded that Lesley Howell and Trevor Buchanan had taken their own lives in anguish. There was no homicide investigation, and the case was closed as a double suicide. The community, though, stunned by the revelation of an affair, accepted the sorrowful narrative. At the funeral services held for Trevor and Lesley on the same day, Hazel wept as a bereaved wife, and Colin stood trembling as the grieving husband. Friends and church members consoled them both, never imagining the story itself was false. In public, Hazel and Colin expressed remorse over the affair and sorrow over their spouses' suicides. reinforcing what everyone around them had swallowed whole. In the months that followed, life moved on, as it tends to do. Hazel Buchanan did her best to fade into the background. She continued to live in the same community, raising her 2 children who had lost their father. She returned to church and carried herself as a woman chastened by tragedy, devoting herself to family and faith while speaking only in perfunctory terms about Trevor's death. Colin Howell also outwardly resumed a normal life. After a period of mourning, he went back to practicing dentistry and caring for the 4 children Lesley had left behind. He collected a substantial life insurance payout from Lesley's death, remarried within a few years, and gradually saw his reputation recover. It appeared that both conspirators had gotten away with their crime, and for almost 2 decades, no one seriously questioned the garage suicide scene. Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan were free, but they were living under the shadow of a secret only the 2 of them shared. For many years, Colin Howell managed to bury his guilt under a veneer of normalcy, but deep down his conscience never quite went silent. The secret that he and Hazel shared festered like a hidden rot. Colin's once unwavering confidence began to crack. In private, he battled nightmares and bouts of depression. He might have carried that burden to his grave had fate not intervened with a series of crushing blows. In 2007, unspeakable tragedy struck Colin's life again. His eldest son, Matthew, died in a freak accident while abroad. The loss of his child devastated Colin. He searched for meaning in the senseless death and began to feel the weight of divine judgment. Not long after, he became entangled in a fraudulent get-rich-quick investment scheme. By 2008, Colin had been swindled out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, leaving him on the brink of financial ruin. He was crushed and desperate, convinced that these calamities were no coincidence. To Colin's mind, it seemed as if God himself was punishing him for the blood on his hands. Nearly 18 years had passed since the murders when Colin reached his breaking point. The dam of guilt finally burst. On a cold day in January of 2009, Colin Howell walked into a meeting of church elders in Coleraine and confessed everything. Voice trembling, yet relieved, he recounted how he and Hazel had plotted and carried out the killings all those years ago. He said that God had told him it was time to come clean. The church elders sat in stunned silence as Colin, tears in his eyes, described in detail the staged car suicide, the hose and exhaust, every dreadful step. After a moment, one of the elders simply said, "You must go to the police." Later that same day, Colin entered the police station in Coleraine. In a calm, matter-of-fact manner, he told detectives the unthinkable truth. The supposed double suicide of 1991 was in fact a double murder. Investigators who had long since closed the case listened in astonishment as this respected dentist-turned-penitent killer laid out the real story. He held back nothing. Colin Howell's voluntary confession was exhaustive and chilling. He implicated himself fully, and he did not protect his former lover. He made it clear that Hazel Buchanan, now Hazel Stewart, had been his willing accomplice. The police wasted little time. Almost 2 decades after Lesley and Trevor's deaths, officers arrived at Hazel's door to arrest her for murder. Hazel, who had since remarried and was living a quiet life, was incredulous at first. She had believed the past was buried forever, but now in 2009, her darkest secret was out in the open. Colin's confession meant she would finally have to answer for her role in the crime. Hazel Stewart was brought into the interrogation room trembling, but determined to save herself. She immediately denied being a murderer. Confronted with Colin's detailed confession implicating her, Hazel's initial response was to shake her head and insist, quote, "He made me do it. I never wanted anyone to die." Thus began a series of tense police interviews in which Hazel spun a very different narrative of the 1991 events, one where she was not a cold-blooded killer, but a woman under extreme duress. Hazel's version of events centered on coercion and fear, that she was being controlled, threatened, and trapped. The prosecution's position was that her actions crossed the line from fear to participation. We'll flag those as competing narratives and focus on what the record can corroborate, then let you feel the weight of the claims. Over hours of questioning, Hazel gradually opened up about her version of the truth. In a recorded interview, her voice wavered as she described Colin's domineering influence over her life. Quote, "He was very controlling," Hazel told detectives. "I was scared. If I said something against him, he'd kill me." Her words came in a desperate rush. She insisted that everything she did the night of the murders was driven by fear and the belief that she had no choice. Hazel painted herself as another one of Colin's victims. She recounted how he had once secretly drugged her during a supposed dental procedure, an episode she offered as proof of how far he would go to control her. She told investigators that he threatened her and that she only helped dispose of evidence, including the length of hose, because she feared for her own life, as well as for her children. Throughout multiple interview sessions, Hazel clung to that story of coercion. When detectives pressed her with the obvious question, why not run or call for help, she repeated that she had been too frightened and too trapped to dare. She maintained that Colin Howell was the mastermind and monster, and that she had never been a willing participant. By the end of the interrogation phase, Hazel's defense was crystal clear. She would claim she acted under duress out of fear for her own safety. Detectives listened, but the question now belonged to the courts. Was Hazel Stewart a terrified pawn or an equal partner in a heinous crime? The wheels of justice began to turn swiftly after the arrests. Colin Howell, having confessed, pleaded guilty to the murders in late 2010. He accepted his fate and was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that carried a minimum term of 21 years before any possibility of release. His days of living a lie were over, but for Hazel, who maintained her innocence, a public trial awaited. In February of 2011, nearly 20 years after the deaths of Trevor Buchanan and Lesley Howell, Hazel Stewart stood in the dock at Coleraine Crown Court. She faced charges of double murder, and the prosecution painted her as an equal partner in what they called a gruesome extermination of two innocent people. Reporters and crowds packed the courtroom, eager to see the woman who had hidden in plain sight for so long. During the trial, Colin Howell himself took the stand as the star witness against his former lover. In painstaking detail, he recounted their affair and the murderous pact that followed. He spared no sordid detail, even divulging how Hazel had become pregnant with his child during the affair and had gotten a secret abortion. A dark blood pact between them. Jurors watched Hazel intently as Colin described her role in the killings. Hazel sat stone-faced through much of his damning testimony, but at times dabbed her eyes with a tissue when the gruesome particulars filled the air. It was a surreal reunion of the conspirators, one unflinchingly telling the truth of their crimes, the other desperately maintaining her facade. Hazel's defense team pressed her narrative of coercion. They argued that she had been under Colin's thrall and too frightened to resist his deadly scheme. Hazel did not testify in her own defense, perhaps fearing cross-examination, but her taped police interviews were played for the court. The jurors heard her wavering voice describing how terrified she was of Colin. They listened to her claims of being helpless and a pawn, forced to assist in covering up a crime she had never wanted. It was Hazel's one chance to convince the jury that she did not act of her own free will. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations did not take long. On March 2nd, 2011, the verdict was announced. Hazel Stewart was found guilty on 2 counts of murder. She closed her eyes as the foreman spoke the words, and a faint cry came from the gallery where her family sat. The judge, in sentencing her to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years, addressed Hazel sternly. He acknowledged Colin Howell's manipulative influence, but ultimately condemned Hazel for her choices. The judge noted that there had been several opportunities over the years when Hazel could have prevented the violence or come forward with the truth, yet she never did. Fear was no excuse for participation in such a heinous act, he intoned. Hazel was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face drained of color, as the weight of 2 decades of deceit finally crashed down upon her. The revelations of the trial sent shockwaves through Northern Ireland and beyond. No one felt the impact more than the families of Lesley and Trevor, who had lived for years believing a lie. They had mourned under the assumption that their loved ones died by their own hands. Now they learned it was cold-blooded murder all along, a truth that was both horrifying and oddly vindicating, proving that neither Lesley nor Trevor had chosen to abandon their families after all. The tale of the suicide pact that wasn't, of a devout dentist and a church-going mother who conspired to murder, became one of the most infamous crime stories in the country's history. It was almost too fantastical to believe, a real-life saga of betrayal, faith, lust, and murder that played out behind closed doors for years before exploding into the light. Today, Colin Howell sits in prison, a convicted double murderer who found religion only to have it compel him to confess. Hazel Stewart, now identified by a prison inmate number instead of as a Sunday school teacher, resides in a separate prison facility, serving out her own long sentence. Both will be well into old age before they have any hope of walking free. They pay the price each day for the lives they took and the lies they told. In retrospect, the deaths of Lesley Howell and Trevor Buchanan stand as a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. For 18 years, the facade of a tragic suicide pact masked a calculated double murder. The confessions, trial, and convictions finally stripped away that mask and ensured that justice, though delayed, was served. And as the final echoes of this story fade, one truth remains. Secrets this dark do not stay buried forever. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com. And produced by Dan Wilder. With original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.